How much longer do we have to stay down here? Danta asked for what felt like the millionth time. Once again he was shushed by his older sister, Danta. She cared for him more than anything, but sometimes he just didn't know when to keep quiet. Even then she couldn't fault him. He was only 6 years old, after all. I told you, we have to wait until the all-clear signal is given. But we've been down here all day. We've never had to hide for this long before. Maybe they forgot, Danta whined. She hugged her brother tightly. I know, but we have to stay to keep safe. They didn't forget. They wouldn't. Shouldn't Mum be back by now? Danta didn't reply. She knew what the answer to that was, but she didn't want her brother to worry. The amount of time they had been waiting was starting to concern even her. Whatever was going on seemed less and less likely to be a simple drill. Shell? Danta asked. What is it? I have to go pee. Danta sighed. She supposed that a short trip to the bathroom couldn't hurt. Whatever risks were preferable to Danta having an accident, and them having to live with the smell. Slowly, she pushed open the hatch and climbed out into the pantry. She creaked open the door, and peered into the kitchen. It was dark, but seemed to be empty. She turned around and pulled Danta out of the hiding hole. Danta dusted her little brother off before setting him down. Immediately, he pattered off to the bathroom with little care for any danger that may be lurking outside. She shook her head, and decided now was as good of a time as any to take a peek outside. She creeped into the living room, keeping the lights off to maintain a sense of stealth. She tiptoed over to a window and cupped her hands around the glass to see out into the street. As she suspected, it was night, and at first the street seemed empty. Sticking out in the dim illumination of a streetlight, a soldier's boot was laying. She focused harder and realized that the boot was attached to a leg. Her heart began to pound as she thought of why a soldier would be laying in the street. Her terrible suspicions were confirmed when several figures came into view. They were dressed in coal black armor, and their white feathers stuck out in the dark with terrifying contrast. She gasped, quickly ducking her head below the window. Thankfully, she didn't think that they saw her. She mulled over what it meant if Feek were walking through her city. Something terrible had happened. Danta had just begun to calm down, when the sound of Danta flushing the toilet rang throughout the house. If her heart was pounding before, now it felt like it was going to explode. She rushed over to grab her brother as the front door began to rattle. She dropped her brother into the hiding hole, but before she jumped in herself, she thought of something. She made her way to the back door and opened it wide. When she moved back into the kitchen, she could hear the front door being broken down. With one swift motion, she slipped into the pantry and softly closed the door behind her. Danta was waiting for her in the hiding hole as she climbed in, shutting the hatch too. Just as the front door gave way, Danta covered her brother's mouth with a hand. They waited in terror, staying as quiet as they could. Heavy footsteps could be heard, causing Danta to weep quietly. She knew he was scared. They both were. But she couldn't comfort him, lest they make too much noise and get found. The footsteps grew closer. They were in the kitchen now. Danta almost screamed when the door to the pantry was ripped open. She thought about how this may be her last moments with Danta in her arms. After what felt like an eternity, a voice, in a language she couldn't understand, came from the back of the house. The footsteps stomped off and out of the house. A massive wave of relief washed over Danta. She held her brother closely and began trying to calm him down. She felt as though she may join him in crying, but at least they were safe for now. Campos looked up at the empty structures that made up the upper surface of Charcier. It was a ghost town, as if the entire population of the city just disappeared one day. In a way, they really did, as most of the city was now underground. If only it wasn't so cold, he could probably enjoy the mountain view. Even Hartosh stayed in the relatively warm Humvee. He snuffed out his cigarette and climbed into his seat. Looking back, Harrison and Hartosh were both passed out. The sun has still yet to rise fully, so Campos decided to just let them rest. They were going to need it anyway. He turned to Tyr in the driver's seat, who was just barely holding on to consciousness himself. "Start her up. We're moving out soon." Tyr snapped awake and quickly hit the starter. The engine struggled in the cold air. Tyr gave the dash a whack before trying again. This time, the Humvee started with no problem. If there was one thing to count on, it was the unpredictable operability of their equipment. The ruckus roused Hartosh, and he let out a loud yawn. He rustled around for a bit before he unbuckled his Kevlar helmet and set it down with a thud. Then the sound of him moving stopped, and he grumbled something that Campos couldn't understand. It likely wasn't in English. "You have to keep that on, Hartosh. It's required when you're in a vehicle," Campos ordered. Hartosh opened an eye and looked at him. Campos just stared back. The Dakar bellowed deeply as he placed the helmet back on his head. Those who weren't accustomed to having a helmet on their head constantly would get migraines from the weight. This was something Campos knew well. However, it was important that Hartosh get used to it if he was to be with his squad. Who knows how long he may have to wear it, so it was best if he struggled through the pain now rather than later. "May I ask a question?" Hartosh asked. Campos turned his body to look at him directly. "Didn't you just?" "I'm being serious," the Dakar huffed. "Right, what is it?" "Can you believe how much things have changed in only a matter of months? It seems like so much has happened in so little time." Campos thought about the question for a moment. The entire situation never really fully sunk in until now. There was an honest-to-God alien sitting in his back seat and speaking to him, not to mention being on an entirely different world. You know, now that I think about it, a lot really has happened. If someone told me a few months ago that I'd be deploying to fight on an alien world, I probably would have thought it was a joke. Maybe I'm just too focused on the mission at hand to really care right now. We're here to do a job. Reflecting is for after the fact. I suppose you have a point. I guess I'm just wondering what the future will look like. How is this all going to end? The future is what we make it. We're already making history, so let's make it good history. Campos smiled and thumped Hartosh's helmet. Now get some sleep. We have a long drive ahead. Hartosh nodded his head, though many things seemed to be going through his mind. He craned his neck and rested his forehead on the back of Campos's seat. Hartosh appeared to finally find a comfortable position, and fell asleep soon after. With that settled, Campos looked at his watch. 0600. It was time to get going. A large bump stirred Hartosh from his slumber. As he opened his eyes, he could see that it was now daylight outside. He breathed in deeply and stretched the best he could within the confines of the vehicle. His eyes soon adjusted to see properly in the bright sunlight. Earthlon drew near. The distant skyline now didn't seem too far away. Using the surface roads wouldn't be his first choice of travelling across the bowl, but the congestion of the railway system would have made transportation nigh impossible. Not even fleeing civilians would brave the roads during an attack, which left them open for the human convoy to blaze through. Of course, there was always the odd group that would be on it. However, they would likely clear the way for the odd machines to pass by. Hartosh wondered what the situation in Iflond currently was. The surprise of the attack certainly let the Vik gain a considerable amount of ground, but he hoped that their initial momentum had already worn off. In most warfare with the Vik, it was hard to distinguish a tangible front line. However, when it came to an urban battle, their irregular warfare was of limited use. They had to fight street to street, building to building, just like the Dakar. Though the Vik were known to burn down entire city blocks if an objective was too hard to break through, the large pillars of smoke in the morning sky was proof that this had already happened in Iflond. "Hey, why'd you look so glum?" Harrison asked from the other side of the vehicle, almost shouting as he did. Hartosh looked over with his eyes, not caring to move his head. "You know what? I got something that'll cheer you up. We saved it just for you." Hartosh was intrigued at that, and he turned himself to face the Marine. His eyes began to widen, and his mouth began to salivate as he saw the familiar bag Harrison pulled out. It was the unmistakable packaging of the dried meat he loved so dearly. When Hartosh was handed the package, he looked for a way to open it. Near the top, he found a small notch in the bag that was labelled "Tear Here." He grabbed the top firmly and ripped the package open, allowing the wonderful scent of the contents to leak out. Hartosh eagerly began to chow down on the flavourful meat. He was only interrupted by Harrison speaking to him. "Slow down. That has to last you for the duration of this mission. We won't be able to get any more until we're back on Earth." Hartosh cleared his throat. "Right, sorry. I'm just not used to food tasting this good." After a few more pieces, he stuffed the bag into his pocket. He let his mind drift as they drove. There wasn't much to talk about, he thought. He watched idly out his window. In only a few minutes, they drew near to the outskirts of the city. It had been a few years since he was last in Iflond. Hartosh wished that his return would have been under different circumstances. "Our break-off point is coming up. According to the map, it should be this next right," Campos told Tyr, who nodded in affirmation. Like clockwork, when the time came, Tyr slowed down and turned the vehicle right. Hartosh strained to look back for his window to see if any other vehicles would pull off with them. Only one took the same turn, while the rest of the convoy kept going down the main road. "What exactly is the plan?" Hartosh asked. "That's right, you were late and missed the briefing." Campos turned around and showed Hartosh the map. The convoy is split up into several different groups. Each group is assigned to a different area. The amount of vehicles in each group depends on the likelihood of us finding our target and how much resistance we'll face. Our area is right there. Campos pointed to a section of the map that was marked in red ink. "A residential district. We suspect that the Vik have already cleared it out and that area wasn't a point of interest, so it's not likely that we'll find the envoy there. Also, because of the low importance of the area, we don't expect to see many Vik. That's why we only have 2 vehicles." Hartosh felt sick at how blasé Campos was when he referred to the area as being cleared out, but he shook the thought. "What about any civilians we find?" Campos looked up at him and furrowed his brow. "We'll do what we can, but the mission is priority." "So we are just going to leave them to die? Human lives have priority over ours?" Hartosh snarled. Campos glared back at him. "You wanted to come with us. If you're not up for it, then you can get out now. I don't want to leave civilians to their fate any more than you, but the mission comes first, and that's the standing order in this Vik." Hartosh growled deeply, his words barely intelligible through his gritted teeth. "Aye, Sergeant." "As long as we're tracking," Campos said, as he turned back around. The ride continued on for a while in silence. As they went deeper into the city, more and more Dakaran soldiers could be seen. Most of them had the distinctive green collars of the engineers. Despite the name, they mostly focused on supplying the troops while maintaining equipment was more secondary. They got many strange looks as they passed by. Most of them probably didn't know what a human was, let alone a Humvee. These past few days had clearly been hard on them. Many of them were rugged and dirty. While they weren't on the front line, the rear echelon had plenty of hard work to be done. When they arrived in the city proper, the sight changed. Now it was mostly infantry soldiers and medics. Hartosh couldn't count the number of medical stations that were full with wounded. A sickening number of them were civilians. All this meant that they were soon approaching the front line. The staring from the soldiers slowly grew more infrequent. Whatever the soldiers had seen was more important than Campus's convoy. If any of the Marines were getting nervous, they weren't showing it. Hartosh, for that matter, was ready to finally get into this fight. Soon, they reached a roadblock and could not drive any further. Dozens of soldiers were lined up along the barrier, facing deeper into the city. Campos opened his door and stepped out. "Hart, on me!" He shouted back into the vehicle. Hartosh then joined him outside of the Humvee. Finally, he could properly stretch his legs. He walked up to the Marine who was surveying the roadblock. "What's the plan now?" Hartosh asked. "I'm still trying to figure that out. Have faith." Campos nodded in a direction behind Hartosh. "On your six. He looks like he might be in charge." Hartosh turned around to see an officer cautiously approaching. The officer was covered in dirt and blood. His uniform had several tears as well. Hartosh gave a salute, to which the officer reciprocated. "Is there anything I can help you gentlemen with?" the officer asked. "We need to pass through your roadblock, sir. Time is of the essence," Hartosh said firmly. The officer looked to the roadblock, then to the two vehicles. He shook his head. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that. This is the farthest anyone is allowed to go. We are to halt here. That's orders from the top too." Hartosh turned to Campos. "I don't think he'll let us through. He says that no one is permitted to go beyond this line." Campos looked the officer up and down before he spoke, while maintaining eye contact. "Well, tell him that we are not subject to his orders. Even if we were, our mission has been greenlit by your government's highest authority." The officer broke eye contact with the Marine, and now he was looking to Hartosh again. He sighed. "It is imperative that we get through here. Our mission has the matriarch's personal approval. If you do not let us pass, you will be going against her will." The officer began to clam up at that, noticeably becoming on edge. That was not something anyone would dare claim unless they could back it up, else they could face dire consequences. Without another word, the officer ordered his men to clear the road. In a matter of minutes, there was a gap large enough to fit the vehicles through, and they were once again on their way. It was a difference of night and day. Suddenly, the streets were empty and dead. "Everyone, keep your eyes peeled and your ears open. Burdine, get that .50 to condition 1, Campos ordered. Hartosh looked down at his rifle. He loaded a magazine into it and wrapped the bolt, just like the Marines had shown him. His mind began to focus, and all distracting thoughts left him as he fell into a combat mindset. He kept a sharp eye on the buildings. The Veek were smart and would wait until the perfect time to ambush. It was likely that they were already surrounded. At their current speed, however, movement would be hard to spot. Tyr looked at Campus. "Sergeant, I don't like this. It seems too quiet." Campos looked back at him. "Just keep a lookout. We'll be able to drive out of any engagements if it comes to that." As they were conversing, Hartosh glanced forward. It only took him a moment to see a familiar feathered figure walk into the road. It was a matter of no one paying attention, and the speed of the vehicle, Before Hartosh could react, they hit the Veek, who only had enough time to spread his wings out and jump a few feet. His body, or rather most of what was left of it, slammed into the windshield, obscuring the view with gore and feathers. The brakes of the Humvee screeched, and Tyr turned the wheel left in a desperate attempt to stop. The front of the vehicle went up onto something, and finally came to a halt. There was less than a moment of silence before the rear vehicle slammed into them, and everything went dark.